there's two really big ideas in transcendental philosophy from Kant that we should really dive a bit deeper into here in order to make sense of this. The first, well, the two ideas are very closely related to each other, but they come from two passages of the Critique of Pure Reason, which is a famous or infamous book in European philosophy. It's incredibly difficult. Um, a lot of the conclusions he comes to are not conclusions that people want to accept. Um, and it starts a kind of whole movement and new way of looking at philosophy, partially in German idealism, what's also called post Kantian philosophy, but also, and more importantly, phenomenology. So, the key assumption that Kant starts with, that it allows him to get the project of transcendental philosophy off the ground, is his hylomorphism. Hylomorphism means matter and form. He wants to look at experience as something composed or comprised of two distinct uh, elements, two distinct realities that come together to make experience what it is. They constitute experience by coming together and forming a whole that is the experience. So let's start with the matter. What is the matter? Well, at the very beginning of the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant says experience is without a doubt the first product that our understanding brings forth as it works on the raw material of sensible sensations. And that sentence really encapsulates the hylomorphism and the entire approach that Kant is going to have to studying our phenomena, to doing phenomenology, explaining the structures and constants and features of consciousness and conscious experience. So basically, the idea here is we have raw material, and the mind is what works on that material as if it was clay. It puts it into a form. The form comes about in experience from our minds. The matter comes from nature, from the world, from perception, from the sensible organs of our body. So the forms of experience are these intellectual components of experience. When we experience the world, we experience something put together, something coherent, something that makes sense. As soon as we experience anything, this is what Kant's saying, we're already experiencing something that makes sense, that has unity, that has relationality with other objects in the world. But what he wants to say is that all of that sensical, coherence comes about entirely by the mind, by the work of the mind, informing the matter, this manifold of chaotic sense data that we get through our senses. And that sense data is really unintelligible, chaotic, and meaningless until our mind comes along to form it. So Kant has a view that is completely opposite in a way from empiricism and from common sense. In common sense, we think the world has meanings already, that those are the objective features of our experience. I see a tree. That's the objective feature of our experience. And Kant wants to say, no, we have sense data that is a whole bunch of colors and textures and things like that. But that's purely subjective. Subjectively, we have this experience of all these qualia, all these qualities. The objective element comes in when the mind forms those data into a coherent object of thought. So it's the mind that forms objectivity, not the mind that forms subjectivity. So that's really opposite to all of the classical ways and the, common sense ways that people think objectivity comes about in the world, comes about in our experience. Objectivity for Kant does not come from the world, it comes from our consciousness. It comes from the constituting act of our intellect putting unity and coherence to this chaotic sense data. And so the fundamental parts of our experience that give it coherence are space, time, and sort of logical connecting judgments that our mind makes. That we see, certain qualities as being the qualities of some object, right? I see this book as having hardness and different colors and all of this, and I see those qualities as being the qualities of this book. And in doing that, I make a judgment about my perception. I perceive these things, and then I say, those have this kind of coherent structure to them. So that's part of this logical operators. And he wants to say there are these logical operators and there's space and time. None of these are features of the world. None of these are things that we find in nature. They're things that we apply to our sensations in order to make sense of them. And so when he actually wants to analyze in detail how we perceive and how we sense this chaotic data, he says some really interesting things, and these are going to be things that Merleau-Ponty and Husserl want to reject. But it's a very complex argument that Kant gives. It's a very complex description that he gives of our sensible experience. It's the one spot, there's a couple spots in the Critique of Pure Reason where Kant is really doing phenomenological description. And this is one of them. There's a couple others. I'm thinking when he talks about the imagination in terms of schematizing. There he gives a kind of phenomenological description as well. But this is one of the very famous passages. It's called the Anticipations of Perception, and I have provided you with an excerpt of that below the video. And it's difficult reading, as any Kant text is. So I'm not expecting you to really, rack your brain on that and struggle with it too much. But I wanted to give you a taste of what was going on there, and I'm going to explain it to you a little bit. So, the Anticipations of Perception is the name of the heading of the section where he talks about this. And if we can think about what an anticipation of perception is in Kant's sense, he wants to say these are the basic components, the constants of all perception and all conscious experience. So what can we say prior to all our future perceptions? What can we say that will apply to all of those? What truths are there that we can formulate in language that will accurately describe all of our future perceptions whatsoever, right? And this question is kind of strange because, I believe that time is an ever-evolving process that moves into novelty. So we can't anticipate everything that's going to happen in the future, right? But even with that being the case, this question can still make sense. For instance, when we perceive anything, this is what Kant is going to get at, we're perceiving some content. There is stuff to perceive, right? If we're perceiving content. We're perceiving something. Some multiplicity of sensible qualities, sounds, sights, warmth, any kind of qualities. There will be qualities. That much we can say prior to any possible future perception we have of nature and the sensible world. So that's the big idea that comes across in the anticipations of perception. It's kind of a simple idea at face value, and it kind of seems like, well, what's the point of making such an obvious statement? But let's dig a bit deeper and then kind of deconstruct the worldview that it implies. So he says basically that all sensible differences that we can find in our perceptual fields have a value greater than 0 of intensity. So if there is brightness of a light, the loudness of a sound, or the hard or softness of a tactile quality, all of these can be more or less. They can have a greater or lesser intensity to that quality, but they can't have a value of 0, right? If there was a value of 0 qualitative intensity within the sensible manifold, we wouldn't be sensing anything at all. And that's going to be really important for the next step that Kant makes, which takes us back to the idea of holomorphism. But before we make that step, let's say a little bit more. So an intensive quality perceived in the world is what he calls a phenomenal reality. So this is something that our mind isn't the author of. These are things that we get by having bodies and by living in the world and by having our body interact with other bodies in the world. It's reality in its appearance. And while our mind does come along to make sense of that and to schematize it into our modes of thinking and prepare it for intellectual judgments in science and things like that. This is Kant's big view. This is the kind of residue in consciousness of something that consciousness itself did not create and did not make. And with this, Kant remains tethered to the world. He's not an idealist. He has this kind of realism in the sense that the real thing in our sensation, in our perception, is this intensive quality that comes through into consciousness and makes us have judgments and coherent experiences of the world. Now, this idea that the level of intensity could be brought down to 0, that would be a complete reduction of all reality of nature. It would be a complete dismissal, a complete ejection, basically, of all reality content in our conscious experience. And here we can think of Descartes, who kind of questions the senses and tries to remove everything in consciousness that isn't consciousness itself. So Kant does that exact same move in the Anticipations of Perception by imaginatively conceiving of a possible dismissal of all sensible qualities, and doing so by, again, imaginatively reducing every intensive value to 0. So there's no more qualitative intensity in our experience whatsoever. What is left of consciousness when we do that, right? So what would be left of consciousness would basically be, or what would be left of our sensible consciousness, our intuitive grasp of awareness, would be only the empty form of space and time. So if all of our sensible intensities occur within a field of space and a temporalization where events happen one after the other in succession, that's all that's left. And because of that kind of thought experiment, that if we remove all the intensive quality, all that's left is space and time. Kant says that space and time are the forms of experience, and that these forms are separable from concrete being in the world, from our sensible being in the world. And they are separable from the contingency of the world. And this is really very close to Plato. Plato wants to say that there are forms and that they exist eternally and unchanging, and that they're free from the sensible world, and that our access to them is not gained through the senses, right? That they're kind of, if not contained already in our consciousness, they actually are our consciousness. They are what makes our consciousness what it is. And thus, matter and form are really completely different types of reality. The matter doesn't really mean anything, it doesn't have any intelligible quality to it unless form comes and informs that matter. So without consciousness, the perceived world, the sensible world, is meaningless and chaotic and disorganized. But form, on the other hand, has no dependence on matter for its objectivity, for its coherence, for its intelligible quality. It's this eternal reality that, when you conceive of space with your intellect, you can do all sorts of things there. You can construct triangles, you can do proofs in mathematics. The world of geometry and of logic and these things, they can operate, according to Kant, utterly separate from the world of appearances and utterly separate from our sensible intuition. So the shape, the form, the intelligible dimension of our experience is separable from experience, but the matter is not. The matter is dependent in a way that the form is independent. And since Kant thinks that sensation is all that we have of nature, right? The only access we have to nature is our subjective sensation of nature. Nature is really reduced to something chaotic, something unruly, something that needs intelligence to come along and order it and make sense of it. And this is like the most problematic idea that Kant has, that the Merleau-Ponty is going to attack. Merleau-Ponty is going to attack a lot of Kant's ideas, but this is the one that really takes the cake for being most problematic and most needing to be critiqued. Now, this whole operation of sort of removing from consciousness what consciousness is not, and then defining that in terms of its main essential qualities, this is still something that phenomenology is going to attempt to do. Now, Merleau-Ponty will talk time and again of the impossibility of a complete reduction. This is exactly what he means. We cannot completely remove consciousness from sensible reality, from the phenomenal reality, and treat it as an eternal thing that never has any dependence on the experiential dimension of consciousness. But the reduction is still an important step, and Merleau-Ponty says that the most important lesson of the reduction is that there cannot be a complete reduction. And what that means is that we still have to do the reduction in order to learn the lesson, right? And we still need to do a kind of Cartesian meditation. We're going to talk about this a lot more, but we still need to do this kind of retreat into consciousness. The reduction, the phenomenological reduction, reduces our conscious experience to its most essential characteristics, the things that can't be removed from consciousness and have it still be consciousness. And this pursuit of the essence of consciousness, what is consciousness? What is it that always persists and always structures our consciousness? What are the inherent, essential attributes and qualities, the invariable dimensions of our consciousness. We need to investigate those. And for Merleau-Ponty, those are going to be tied up with the world and with nature and with history and are going to be evolutionary. So all of those kind of things that I just said diminish this kind of Platonic, eternal, unchanging essence view of consciousness. But it doesn't completely eliminate this idea of there being essential properties to consciousness. So the phenomenological reduction boils down. So a reduction, in cooking is when you reduce something down, right? When you boil it down to a more intense form of what it is. And we can also think of kind of straining out everything that it's not. We need to get down to consciousness in its essence. What makes it what it is. And Kant and Husserl, their approach to this question has remained very mathematical. We want to get to a kind of definition in the sense of like a triangle is a shape with three sides whose interior angles add up to 180 degrees. Now that definition applies to every triangle, right? And if we have consciousness in a very diverse set of manifestations of what consciousness is, we can think here of intellectual consciousness, embodied consciousness, perceptual consciousness, aesthetic consciousness, even consciousness of the sacred and spiritual consciousness. If we want to try to have a definition that applies to all of those very different, divergent, diverse types of consciousness, it's going to be very difficult to get at that. And so Merleau-Ponty kind of continuously pokes at the assumptions behind the mathematical approach to the question. And he does attack this idea of essence, but there are certain aspects of approaching consciousness as having an essence, and the whole paradigm of essence that he doesn't get rid of. So a lot of postmodern phenomenologists attack continuously this idea of essence, and most of the time it's on very good grounds. But there are certain aspects of that essence approach to consciousness that Merleau-Ponty, and I believe phenomenology in general, cannot completely get away from. No matter how much we modify our approach to the understanding consciousness, there's something about awareness that never goes away, right? That being aware, being present to our consciousness, having a sort of self-awareness, knowing intuitively that we are conscious, there's something there that we cannot reduce and that we cannot remove from our phenomenological descriptions of what it is to be conscious. Even in the most, embodied perceptual consciousness, child consciousness, the consciousness when we're just waking up from being asleep, or in a kind of dream state, or a delirium, or even in the kind of grasp of absolute presence in our awareness. All of these still, there is traces of that kind of essential nature of consciousness, that pure being aware of our conscious state. So in phenomenology, we're going to have to look at that type of being, which is a type of being that is unique to our consciousness as an immediate lived reality. We are our consciousness, right? We are our lived body. And the access that we have to that domain of reality is different than the access that we have to any other reality. Somebody else's mind, the physical world, things like that. And in our consciousness, we find evidence. Things are evident in our consciousness. And if we become uncomfortable with the idea of essence because it sounds too mathematical, too intellectual, too a priori, too eternal, we can't get rid of this idea of evidence. When something is evident, we grasp its reality and we don't question it, right? If something is evident, it's evident. And the way things are evident is going to be really important, and that's going to be something that we're going to have to describe in great detail. What is evident in this phenomena that I know to be true? And so if we think back to Kant, my perception is an intensity that is greater than zero. I have a qualitative experience of qualities that have a value of intensity that's greater than zero. And that is something that's evident in our perception. And it's what makes it evident that we are perceiving in general. So that's one aspect of evidence in our consciousness. And then there's this other aspect of evidence in our consciousness, which is that there are traces of consciousness acting to make sense of our experience. You know, even if we reject Kant's very dualistic view of matter and form, that the intellect forces the material, sensible world to have an order to it, even if we reject that, we still know that our consciousness is doing something actively in our perception. We know that the perception of the world is being modified and informed to some degree by our consciousness. So we have traces in our conscious experience, in our awareness, that consciousness is at work doing something to make sense of our conscious experience. So we have these two pieces of evidence, basically. We know that we have reality of a certain intensity given to us in the sensible world through sounds and through sights and through feelings in our skin. That kind of thing is undeniably evident to us. And at the same time, it's undeniably evident that our consciousness is doing something. That the way we intend objects in the world, the way that we experience objects, that our attitude, all of that is forming and informing the way that the sensible world appears to us. So while we cannot get at the material of our sensations directly, and while we cannot get at the acts of our consciousness directly, we have evidence of both of these things. We have evidence of the material object given to us in a sensible intuition. Now, that object is still partially transcendent of my consciousness, right? I can't grasp the entirety of some object at once. I can look at the book, but there's an inside of the book, there's a back of the book. I can feel it, but then if I'm feeling it, I'm feeling this side and not this side. I cannot grasp the entirety of that object at once. The book remains transcendent to my consciousness. It exceeds every presentation I have of it. Also means that some of its reality exceeds what I grasp in that presentation. So it's evident to me, but I don't grasp it completely in the way that I grasp like the number 3. And I know exactly what the number 3 is, and I dominate that idea, and I have it in every nook and cranny, completely figured out. The physical world that I get through my senses cannot be dominated by intelligence in that way. Likewise, my consciousness cannot be dominated in that way either. I'm perceiving and I'm experiencing a flow in consciousness, and things are appearing to me in that, and in that appearance, I know that my consciousness has done something to make sense of this experience, to constitute this experience, to make it a coherent experience, but I don't have this kind of dominating experience of that process, of that act of my consciousness. These are horizons that exceed what I can grasp and what I can dominate with my intellect, right? We cannot get at these things as objects. We get around in the world by thinking, I know what a toaster is because I can use it, I can put my toast in there and make use of it. And, if I don't know the inner workings of that, I don't really care because it doesn't affect my way of getting around the world. But when you take a step back and look at that, this assumption of our kind of practical consciousness, that we know what things are, that we have a kind of complete grasp of them, that they are clearly and distinctly intelligible to us, really starts falling apart as soon as we reflect on our experience at all. And phenomenology is here to kind of loosen these threads of our mind's engagement with the world. We are engaged with objects and with experiences, and as soon as we kind of loosen these threads, we see the components coming together. We see how they're woven into this fabric of our perceived world. And Husserl, following Kant, want to do a complete reduction, which would be to kind of cut the threads that tie our consciousness into the world. And Merleau-Ponty's big idea and his, what he takes from Husserl is that the activity of completely reducing our consciousness to its essence, the main lesson of that reduction is that there cannot be a complete reduction. That our threads can be loosened, but they cannot be cut. We cannot sever these ties in the way that Kant wants to do in the Anticipations of Perception with his hylomorphism, where form is something completely separable, and the way Husserl, in a way, attempts to do by reducing consciousness to its essence, and its essence being something eternal and different from the physical world, from nature, and from our being in the world and our embodiment. So we need to roll back, in a way, the extreme radical approach of Husserl and of Kant, and we need to see how sort of these matter-form relationships, these hylomorphisms, they still exist, but they don't exist in this way where matter and form are separable. They exist in a way where matter and form are inseparable, intimately connected, interwoven, and where they can have their threads loosened, but they cannot have them unwoven or cut. And so let's think about spirit. Spirit is a kind of something more than physical reality, but it's also something that is intimately embodied in the world, right? Spirit is breath, and breath is both physical and kind of intellectual and intelligent and vital and alive. It's dynamic, but it's also corporeal. And that's the world where Merleau-Ponty does his phenomenology. Think about expression, too. Expression is something where the intelligible realm, something where the intellectual and spiritual dimensions of human consciousness, or consciousness in general, are woven into the fabric of a physical world and of movements and of patterns of movements. So expression is, again, this kind of matter-form relationship, but the matter and the form are so closely interwoven that you can't really say where one starts and where one stops. And in phenomenology, we are going to loosen these threads. We're going to try and see which parts are weaving into which and how there's a kind of reciprocal relationship between the matter and form, but where they're ultimately not separable from each other.